The morning mist hung heavy over the Norman countryside as Obergefreiter Klaus Weber adjusted his field glasses, peering through the haze toward Omaha Beach. The distant rumble of Allied landing craft had been echoing across the landscape for hours, but what he saw now made him chuckle. American Sherman tanks were rolling off the landing vessels like toys from a factory assembly line, their boxy silhouettes looking almost comical compared to the sleek, predatory lines of his Panzer IV positioned in the tree line above. "Look at those tin cans," Weber muttered to his loader, Hans Kruger, who was busy organizing armor-piercing rounds in their cramped fighting compartment. "The Americans think they can win this war with those sardine boxes on tracks." Kruger peered through his own periscope and let out a snort of derision. "My grandmother's cooking pot has thicker armor than those things. Remember what happened to the British Shermans at Villers-Bocage? Wittmann turned them into scrap metal in minutes." Weber nodded, his confidence bolstered by memories of German tank superiority. The Wehrmacht had spent years perfecting their armored doctrine, and their Panzer IV had proven itself time and again against Allied armor. The Sherman's reputation preceded it: thin armor, inadequate main gun, and a disturbing tendency to burst into flames when hit. American tankers had even nicknamed their own vehicles Ronnies after the cigarette lighter, a grim acknowledgement of their flammability. Through his commander's cupola, Weber watched as more Shermans formed up in the distance, their crews probably green replacements fresh from training camps in Georgia or Texas. He could almost picture them inside their steel coffins, sweating in the June heat, hands trembling as they gripped unfamiliar controls. These boys had no idea what awaited them in the hedgerows of Normandy. "Herr Obergefreiter," came the crackling voice of Hauptmann Friedrich Steiner through the radio. "Enemy armor advancing along the coastal road. Prepare for engagement. Remember, these are the same Shermans we've been destroying for months. Make every shot count." Weber keyed his microphone. "Understood, Herr Hauptmann. Panzer 231 ready for action." He turned to his gunner, Unteroffizier Ernst Hoffmann, a veteran who had served since the Polish campaign. "Ernst, you see that lead Sherman? The one with the white star on the turret?" Hoffmann's eye was already pressed to his sight. "Range 800 meters, moving left to right at moderate speed, easy target. Wait for my command. Let them get closer. I want to see the fear in their eyes when we open fire." But as Weber continued observing the approaching American column, something nagged at him. These particular Shermans looked different somehow. The armor seemed thicker, more angular, with strange rectangular boxes mounted on the turret sides. He had studied Allied tank recognition charts extensively, but these modifications were unfamiliar. "Hans, pass me the recognition manual," Weber ordered. As he flipped through the pages showing various Sherman variants, he found nothing matching what he was seeing. The M4A1, M4A3, even the newer M4A3E8 Easy 8, none had these peculiar additions. "Probably just spare fuel cans or extra equipment," Kruger suggested when Weber voiced his concerns. "Americans love their creature comforts. They probably mounted coffee makers and ice cream machines on those things." The comment drew chuckles from the crew, but Weber remained uneasy. His father had been a tank commander in the Great War, and had drilled into him the importance of respecting your enemy, no matter how inferior their equipment appeared. "Never underestimate a desperate man with a weapon," the elder Weber had said. "Desperation breeds innovation." As the Sherman column drew closer, Weber could make out more details. The lead tank's commander was visible in his hatch, a stocky man with sergeant stripes who seemed remarkably calm for someone advancing into German-held territory. This wasn't the behavior of green troops. These men moved with the confidence of veterans. "Something's not right," Weber murmured, but before he could analyze further, Hauptmann Steiner's voice crackled through the radio again. "All units, enemy tanks now within effective range. Open fire at will. Show these Americans what German engineering can accomplish." Weber felt the familiar surge of adrenaline as combat approached. Despite his unease, he had complete faith in his crew and their Panzer IV. They had survived the Russian front, where they had faced T-34s and KV-1s far more formidable than anything the Americans could field. These Shermans, modified or not, would join the growing graveyard of Allied armor scattered across the Norman countryside. "Ernst, target the lead Sherman. High explosive first, then armor piercing if needed. Target acquired, ready to fire. Weber took a deep breath, feeling the weight of command and the trust his crew placed in him. In a few moments, they would add another victory to their tally, another confirmation of German tactical and technological superiority. The Americans might have numbers, but the Wehrmacht had skill, experience, and superior equipment. Fire. The Panzer IV rocked as the 75mm gun roared, sending its deadly projectile streaking toward the unsuspecting Sherman. Weber watched through his periscope, already anticipating the familiar sight of enemy armor erupting in flames and smoke. This was how tank battles were supposed to unfold, swift, decisive, with German victory inevitable. But what happened next would shatter everything Klaus Weber thought he knew about armored warfare. Years before this moment, in the industrial heartland of America, a different kind of war was being fought. While German engineers perfected their Tiger and Panther tanks, American scientists and metallurgists worked frantically in laboratories and testing facilities, driven by reports of devastating German anti-tank capabilities. The Sherman tank, despite its mass production advantages, was proving inadequate against the latest German armor and weaponry. In a classified facility outside Detroit, Dr. Margaret Chen, a brilliant material scientist who had emigrated from China before the war, was leading a revolutionary project. Her team had been studying captured German ammunition and armor samples, searching for ways to neutralize the Wehrmacht's technological advantages. Traditional approaches, thicker armor, bigger guns, were proving insufficient and impractical for mass production. "We need to think differently, Doctor," Chen had told her team during one late-night session in early 1944. "Instead of making our tanks harder to penetrate, what if we could make enemy shells less effective?" The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While analyzing high-speed footage of German anti-tank rounds striking Allied armor, Chen noticed that the projectile's effectiveness depended entirely on maintaining their velocity and trajectory through the initial impact. If that could be disrupted at the moment of contact, even the most powerful German gun might be neutralized. Working with explosive specialists and metallurgists, Chen's team developed what they called reactive armor, thin metal boxes containing carefully calibrated explosive charges that would detonate outward when struck by an incoming projectile. The explosion would disrupt the penetrator's path, causing it to tumble or fragment before it could breach the main armor. The concept was revolutionary, but implementing it required solving countless technical challenges. The explosive charges had to be powerful enough to deflect armor-piercing rounds, but controlled enough not to damage the tank itself. The timing had to be perfect, the placement precise, and the entire system had to be reliable under combat conditions. Sergeant John "Tank" Morrison had been chosen to command the first combat-ready Sherman equipped with this experimental armor. A veteran of the North African campaign, Morrison had lost 2 tanks to German anti-tank guns and understood better than most the psychological impact of technological inferiority. When his superiors briefed him on the classified project, his reaction was skeptical. "You're telling me these little boxes are going to stop an 88mm shell?" Morrison had asked, running his hand along the rectangular modules now mounted on his Sherman's turret and hull sides. "That's exactly what we're telling you, Sergeant," replied Colonel James Patterson, the project's military liaison. "But this technology is absolutely classified. As far as anyone knows, you're commanding a standard M4A3. The enemy cannot learn about this system under any circumstances. Morrison's crew, Gunner Corporal Mike Rodriguez, Loader Private Tommy Chen, no relation to Dr. Chen, and driver Private Bobby Jackson, had trained extensively with the modified Sherman at a secret facility in Nevada. They learned to trust the reactive armor through countless live-fire exercises, watching in amazement as German anti-tank rounds that should have destroyed them harmlessly deflected off their tank's surface. "It's like having a guardian angel made of explosives," Rodriguez had joked during training. But the humor masked a deeper appreciation for the technology that might keep them alive. Now, as Morrison's Sherman advanced through the Norman countryside, he could see German positions in the tree line ahead. His radio crackled with reports from reconnaissance units about enemy armor concentrations, including the feared Panzer IVs that had dominated European battlefields for years. "Driver, steady as she goes," Morrison commanded through the intercom. "Gunner, you see that muzzle flash in the trees? Panzer IV, about 800 yards. "I see him, Sarge," Rodriguez replied, already traversing the turret toward the target. "Want me to engage?" "Negative. Let him take the first shot. We need to see how well our new armor performs under actual combat conditions." Morrison's calm demeanor masked his own nervousness. Despite extensive testing, this would be the reactive armor's first encounter with German anti-tank weapons in actual combat. Everything depended on Dr. Chen's calculations being correct, on the explosive charges functioning as designed, on 1,000 variables aligning perfectly in the chaos of battle. Through his periscope, Morrison could see the German tank clearly now, its long barrel trained directly at his Sherman. He knew the enemy commander was probably feeling confident, perhaps even amused at the prospect of destroying another inferior American tank. That confidence was about to be shattered in the most dramatic way possible. The German muzzle flashed, and Morrison instinctively braced for impact even though he knew the reactive armor should protect them. In the split second it took for the German shell to cross the distance between the tanks, he thought about all the American tankers who had died in Shermans, victims of German technological superiority and their own equipment's limitations. That was about to change forever. The German shell struck Morrison's Sherman with a thunderous crash that echoed across the Norman countryside. Inside the Panzer IV, Klaus Weber watched through his periscope, expecting to see the familiar sight of American armor erupting in flames. Instead, what he witnessed defied everything he understood about tank warfare. The projectile hit the Sherman's turret side with perfect accuracy, but instead of penetrating the armor, it seemed to simply disappear in a brilliant flash of light and smoke. The reactive armor box detonated exactly as Dr. Chen had designed, the controlled explosion deflecting the German round harmlessly into the air. Morrison's Sherman continued advancing, completely undamaged. Weber blinked hard, certain his eyes were deceiving him. "What the hell just happened?" he shouted to his gunner. "Ernst, did you see that?" Hoffman was equally bewildered, his eyes still pressed to the gun sight. "Direct hit, Herr Obergefreiter. I saw the impact, but the enemy tank is still moving." "Impossible," Weber muttered, but even as he spoke he was already formulating explanations. Perhaps the shell had been defective, or maybe they had struck at such an angle that the round had simply ricocheted. German ammunition was reliable, but nothing was perfect in war. "Load armor piercing," Weber ordered. "We'll put the next one through their front plate." But before Hoffman could comply, Morrison's Sherman had stopped and was traversing its turret toward their position. The American tank's 76mm gun was smaller than the Panzer IV's 75mm, but Weber knew better than to underestimate any enemy weapon. He had seen too many good men die from overconfidence. "Target acquired," Hoffman reported. "Ready to fire." "Fire!" The Panzer IV's gun roared again, sending another armor-piercing round streaking toward the Sherman. This time Weber watched even more carefully, his field glasses focused on the point of impact. Once again the German shell struck true, hitting the Sherman's frontal armor with devastating force, and once again the reactive armor performed exactly as designed, the explosive charge detonating outward and deflecting the penetrator before it could breach the main armor. Morrison's tank shuddered from the impact but remained fully operational. Through his commander's periscope, Morrison could see the German tank crew's confusion and growing panic. He keyed his radio to contact his supporting Shermans, which were advancing on either flank. "Bravo 2, this is Bravo 1. Enemy armor confirmed. 1 Panzer IV in the tree line, approximately 700 yards. Engaging now." Rodriguez had the German tank perfectly centered in his gun sight. "Target acquired, Sarge. Ready to fire." "Send it." The Sherman 76mm gun fired, its high-velocity armor-piercing round covering the distance to the Panzer IV in less than a second. Unlike the German shells that had harmlessly bounced off the reactive armor, the American round found its mark with devastating effect. The projectile punched through the Panzer IV's side armor like paper, detonating inside the fighting compartment with catastrophic results. Weber had just enough time to register the incoming shell before his world exploded in fire and shrapnel. The American round penetrated the ammunition storage, causing a secondary explosion that tore the Panzer IV apart from the inside. Weber was thrown clear of the commander's hatch, his uniform on fire, his ears ringing from the blast. Hoffman and the driver were killed instantly, while Kruger crawled from the wreckage with severe burns covering half his body. As Weber rolled on the ground to extinguish the flames consuming his clothing, he could hear other German tanks engaging the American column. Radio chatter filled the airwaves as panzer commanders reported the same impossible phenomenon: direct hits that caused no damage, shells that seemed to vanish in flashes of light and smoke. All units, came Hauptmann Steiner's increasingly frantic voice. What is your status? Report enemy casualties. The responses that came back painted a picture of disaster. Panzer after panzer reported successful hits that caused no damage, followed by devastating return fire that destroyed German tanks with ruthless efficiency. In less than 10 minutes, Weber's company had lost half its armor to an enemy that should have been easy prey. Weber struggled to his feet, his body racked with pain from burns and shrapnel wounds. Through the smoke and chaos, he could see Morrison's Sherman advancing past the burning wreckage of German tanks, its strange rectangular armor boxes intact and functional. Other modified Shermans were spreading out across the battlefield, their crews growing more confident with each successful engagement. Mein Gott, Weber whispered, finally understanding that they were facing something entirely new. This wasn't just another variant of the Sherman tank. This was a technological revolution that rendered German anti-tank weapons obsolete. Kruger crawled over to Weber, his face a mask of pain and confusion. Klaus, what happened? Our shells hit them dead center. I saw the impacts myself. Weber helped his loader to cover behind a fallen tree, his mind racing to process what he had witnessed. Years of training and combat experience had taught him to analyze enemy capabilities quickly, but this defied all conventional understanding of armored warfare. I don't know, Weber admitted, watching as more German tanks fell victim to the mysterious American armor. But whatever they've done to those Shermans, it's changed everything. The sound of approaching American infantry forced Weber and Kruger to retreat deeper into the Norman hedgerows. As they stumbled through the undergrowth, Weber could hear the distinctive rumble of Sherman engines growing closer. The Americans were advancing with a confidence he had never seen before, no longer the hesitant, outgunned force that German tankers had grown accustomed to fighting. Behind them, the battlefield was littered with burning German armor. Panzer IVs that had dominated European battlefields for years lay twisted and destroyed, their crews dead or fleeing. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical losses. German tank crews who had considered themselves invincible were now questioning everything they thought they knew about armored warfare. Weber managed to reach a German communication post hidden in a bombed-out farmhouse. The radio operator, a young corporal named Friedrich, looked up with relief as the two survivors stumbled through the door. Obergefreiter Weber, thank God you're alive. Hauptmann Steiner has been trying to reach your unit for the past hour. Weber grabbed the radio handset with trembling hands. Hauptmann, this is Weber. My tank is destroyed. Crew casualties heavy. We need to talk immediately. Steiner's voice crackled through the static. Weber, what the hell is happening out there? I'm getting reports of direct hits causing no damage. Are your crews missing their targets? Negative, sir. We're hitting them dead center, but the shells aren't penetrating. The Americans have done something to their armor, some kind of modification we've never seen before. There was a long pause before Steiner responded. That's impossible, Weber. Our intelligence reports show standard Sherman variants, nothing about new armor technology. With respect, sir, our intelligence is wrong. I watched my gunner put 2 armor-piercing rounds into the same Sherman at point-blank range. Both hits were perfect, but neither one penetrated. Then they destroyed us with a single shot. Weber could hear other voices in the background as Steiner consulted with his staff. The implications of Weber's report were staggering. If the Americans had developed armor that could defeat German anti-tank weapons, the entire strategic situation in Normandy would have to be re-evaluated. Weber, I'm sending a recovery team to your position. I need you to get back here immediately for a full debriefing. And Weber, not a word about this to anyone else until we understand what we're dealing with. As Weber waited for extraction, he continued monitoring radio traffic from other German units. The reports were uniformly catastrophic. Tank after tank, destroyed by an enemy that seemed immune to German firepower. Veteran crews who had survived the Russian front were being wiped out by American tankers they had previously considered inferior. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. German tank doctrine was built on the assumption of technological superiority, the belief that superior engineering and training would always triumph over enemy numbers. If that assumption was false, if the Americans had somehow leapfrogged German technology, then the entire foundation of Wehrmacht armored tactics would need to be reconsidered. Morrison's Sherman continued its advance through the Norman countryside, leaving a trail of destroyed German armor in its wake. The reactive armor had performed flawlessly, deflecting every German anti-tank round without sustaining any significant damage. His crew's confidence was growing with each successful engagement, their previous fear of German tanks replaced by an almost euphoric sense of invulnerability. "Sarge, this is incredible," Rodriguez called out over the intercom. "I've never seen Krauts retreat this fast. They're running from us like we're driving a Tiger tank." Morrison understood his gunner's excitement, but he also recognized the danger of overconfidence. The reactive armor was revolutionary, but it wasn't magic. German crews would adapt, find new tactics, perhaps develop countermeasures. The technological advantage they currently enjoyed might be temporary. "Stay sharp, Rodriguez. This is just the beginning. Once the Germans figure out what we're doing, they'll find ways to counter it." But for now, Morrison's modified Sherman represented the future of armored warfare, a glimpse of how technology could shift the balance of power in ways that traditional military thinking couldn't anticipate. The German laughter that had greeted the Sherman's arrival in Normandy had been replaced by confusion, fear, and the growing realization that the war had just taken a dramatic turn in favor of the Allies. The classified briefing room at Aberdeen Proving Ground had been buzzing with activity for months before the first reactive armor modules ever reached Normandy. Dr. Margaret Chen stood before a wall covered with technical diagrams, ballistics charts, and photographs of destroyed Allied tanks, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing to the assembled military officials. "Gentlemen, we're losing the armor race," she had declared during that pivotal meeting in March 1944. "German anti-tank weapons are evolving faster than our ability to thicken armor plating. The Tiger II's 80mm gun can penetrate our heaviest Sherman variants at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. We need a fundamentally different approach." Colonel Patterson, representing the Ordnance Department, had leaned forward with skepticism evident in his expression. "Dr. Chen, with respect, we've been building tanks for decades. Armor protection has always been about thickness and angle. What you're proposing sounds like science fiction." Chen had clicked to the next slide, showing high-speed photography of German tungsten core projectiles striking Allied armor. "Science fiction becomes science fact when necessity demands it, Colonel. Look at these impact sequences. The penetrator maintains its velocity and trajectory through the initial contact phase. If we can disrupt that trajectory at the moment of impact, we can defeat even the most powerful anti-tank rounds." The concept she outlined was deceptively simple, but extraordinarily complex to implement. Explosive reactive armor would consist of metal boxes containing precisely calibrated charges that would detonate outward when struck by an incoming projectile. The explosion would occur in milliseconds, fast enough to disrupt the penetrator before it could breach the main armor, but controlled enough to avoid damaging the tank itself. "The mathematics are challenging," Chen had continued, her pointer tracing ballistic trajectories on the projection screen. "We need to calculate the exact explosive force required to deflect different types of projectiles while accounting for impact angles, velocities, and armor thickness. Too little explosive force and the system fails. Too much and we destroy our own tank." Dr. Robert Steinberg, a metallurgist from MIT, had raised his hand. "Margaret, even if the concept works, how do we manufacture these modules in sufficient quantities?" We're talking about precision explosive devices that need to function reliably under combat conditions. That's where American industrial capacity becomes our secret weapon, Chen had replied. We're not trying to build a few perfect tanks like the Germans. We're creating a system that can be mass-produced and retrofitted to existing Sherman variants. Every tank becomes potentially immune to German anti-tank weapons. The development process had been grueling. Chen's team worked 18-hour days, testing different explosive compositions, metal configurations, and trigger mechanisms. Early prototypes either failed to detonate properly or exploded with such force that they damaged the test tanks. The breakthrough came when they developed a shaped charge configuration that directed the explosive force outward and slightly forward, creating a cone of disruption that would deflect incoming projectiles without harming the tank's crew or systems. Live fire testing at the Nevada facility had been both terrifying and exhilarating. The first successful test involved a captured German 75mm anti-tank gun firing at a Sherman equipped with prototype reactive armor. When the German shell struck the reactive module and harmlessly deflected into the desert sand, the assembled observers had erupted in cheers. "It works," Chen had whispered, hardly believing her own eyes. "It actually works." But success in controlled testing was only the beginning. The reactive armor modules had to function reliably in the chaos of combat, withstand the vibrations and stresses of tank operations, and remain effective after exposure to weather, mud, and the countless variables of battlefield conditions. Sergeant Morrison's crew had been among the first to train with the operational system. Their initial reaction had been skepticism mixed with hope. Skepticism because they had seen too many promised wonder weapons fail in combat. Hope because they desperately needed something to level the playing field against German armor. "The first time you see a German shell bounce off your tank, you'll understand," Colonel Patterson had told Morrison during their final briefing. "But remember, this technology is absolutely classified. The enemy cannot learn about reactive armor under any circumstances. As far as anyone knows, you're commanding a standard Sherman with some additional equipment boxes." The secrecy surrounding the project was absolute. Even Morrison's own crew hadn't been told the exact nature of their tank's modifications until they were already in training. The cover story was that they were testing new communication equipment and additional fuel storage. Explanations that accounted for the rectangular boxes mounted on their tank's exterior. Tommy Chen, the young loader who shared a surname with the project's lead scientist, had been particularly curious about the modifications. "Sarge, these boxes don't look like radio equipment to me. They're too heavy, and there are no antenna connections." Morrison had stuck to the cover story, even with his own crew. "That's above our pay grade, soldier. Our job is to drive this tank into combat and kill Germans. Everything else is classified." The psychological preparation had been as important as the technical training. Morrison's crew needed to trust their equipment completely, to advance into German anti-tank fire with confidence that their armor would protect them. Doubt or hesitation could be fatal in tank combat, where split-second decisions often determined survival. Now, as Morrison's Sherman advanced through the Norman hedgerows, the months of development and testing were proving their worth. Each deflected German shell validated Dr. Chen's calculations. Each successful engagement demonstrated the revolutionary potential of reactive armor technology. But the Germans were already beginning to adapt. Klaus Weber's report had reached the highest levels of Wehrmacht command, triggering an urgent investigation into American armor modifications. German intelligence officers were analyzing every scrap of information about the mysterious Sherman variants, trying to understand how their most reliable anti-tank weapons had suddenly become ineffective. Oberst Heinrich Müller, commanding the 21st Panzer Division, had convened an emergency meeting of his senior officers. The reports from the front lines were consistent and disturbing. German tanks were being destroyed by an enemy that seemed immune to their most powerful weapons. "Gentlemen, we're facing a crisis," Müller had announced to his assembled tank commanders. "Our Panzer IVs are being destroyed by Sherman tanks that our shells cannot penetrate. I need answers, and I need them immediately." Major Karl Brenner, the division's intelligence officer, had spread reconnaissance photographs across the conference table. "Sir, we've identified unusual modifications on some American tanks. These rectangular boxes mounted on the turret and hull sides appear to be some kind of additional armor system. Weber, still recovering from burns suffered in his tank's destruction, had been brought in to provide first-hand testimony. His account of shells striking enemy tanks without effect had been met with initial skepticism, but the mounting evidence from other survivors painted a consistent picture. "It's not just thicker armor," Weber had insisted. "The shells are hitting, but they're not penetrating. There's some kind of explosion at the moment of impact, like the enemy tank is shooting back at our projectiles." The implications were staggering. If the Americans had developed armor that could defeat German anti-tank weapons, the entire strategic balance in Normandy would shift dramatically. German defensive tactics relied heavily on superior tank technology to offset Allied numerical advantages. Without that technological edge, Wehrmacht forces would face overwhelming odds. Müller had turned to his chief engineer, Hauptmann Franz Dietrich, a former automotive designer who understood both armor and ballistics. "Franz, is such a system theoretically possible?" Dietrich had studied the reconnaissance photographs carefully before responding. "Herr Oberst, explosive reactive armor has been discussed in theoretical papers, but we dismissed it as impractical. The engineering challenges seemed insurmountable, and we assumed the Americans lacked the technical sophistication to develop such a system." "Apparently we were wrong," Müller had replied grimly. "The question now is how we counter this technology. Our current anti-tank weapons are clearly inadequate." The German response was swift but limited by available resources. Engineers began developing new ammunition types designed to defeat reactive armor, but such weapons would take months to design, test, and manufacture. In the meantime, German tank crews would have to find tactical solutions to a technological problem. Weber had volunteered for a reconnaissance mission to gather more intelligence about the American armor modifications. Despite his injuries, he was one of the few survivors who had observed the reactive armor in action, making his expertise invaluable for developing countermeasures. "I need to see these tanks up close," Weber had told Müller. "If we can understand how the system works, we might find weaknesses we can exploit." The mission would be extraordinarily dangerous. Weber would have to infiltrate American-held territory, observe enemy tanks without being detected, and return with detailed intelligence about the reactive armor system. The chances of survival were minimal, but the information could be crucial for German defensive efforts. As Weber prepared for his reconnaissance mission, Morrison's Sherman continued its advance through the Norman countryside. The reactive armor had transformed not just the tactical situation but the psychological dynamic of tank warfare. American crews who had previously feared German armor were now advancing with confidence, their faith in their equipment growing with each successful engagement. The secret weapon that German troops had laughed at was systematically destroying the foundation of Wehrmacht armored doctrine, one deflected shell at a time. The darkness of the Norman night provided perfect cover as Klaus Weber crawled through the muddy hedgerows toward the American forward positions. His reconnaissance mission had taken on desperate urgency as reports continued flooding in about German tank losses to the mysterious Sherman variants. Every hour of delay meant more panzer crews dying in what should have been routine engagements. Weber's burn still ached beneath his field dressings, but pain was secondary to the mission's importance. He carried a compact camera, detailed sketches of what he had observed, and orders to gather any intelligence that might help German engineers develop countermeasures to the American armor system. Through his field glasses, Weber could see Morrison's Sherman parked in a grove of apple trees, its crew performing routine maintenance under blackout conditions. The rectangular boxes that had deflected his shells were clearly visible in the moonlight, their purpose still mysterious but their effectiveness undeniable. "What are you hiding?" Weber whispered to himself, adjusting his position to get a better view of the tank's modifications. As he watched, he noticed something crucial that previous intelligence reports had missed. The reactive armor boxes weren't uniformly distributed across the tank's surface. They were concentrated on the frontal arc and turret sides, areas most likely to receive direct fire. The rear and lower hull remained protected only by standard Sherman armor. Weber carefully sketched the placement pattern, noting gaps in coverage that might represent vulnerabilities. If German tanks could maneuver to attack from specific angles, they might still be able to achieve penetrating hits. The information was valuable, but he needed more details about the boxes themselves. A careless movement sent a small stone tumbling down the embankment, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet night. Weber froze as an American sentry turned toward his position, rifle ready. For several agonizing minutes, the soldier scanned the hedgerow where Weber lay hidden, his finger on the trigger. "Probably just a rabbit," the sentry muttered to his companion, but he continued watching the area with obvious suspicion. Weber remained motionless until the Americans resumed their patrol, then carefully repositioned himself for a closer look at the Sherman. What he saw next would change his understanding of the reactive armor system entirely. One of the rectangular boxes had been damaged during the day's fighting. Its outer casing cracked open to reveal the contents inside. Weber could see metal plates, what appeared to be explosive material, and a complex trigger mechanism. The engineering was sophisticated, far more advanced than German intelligence had assumed possible from American designers. "Mein Gott," Weber breathed, finally understanding the system's true nature. The boxes contained shaped charges designed to detonate outward when struck by incoming projectiles. The explosion would disrupt the penetrator's trajectory, causing it to tumble or fragment before reaching the main armor. It was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness. But Weber also noticed something else that gave him hope. The damaged box showed signs of stress fractures around the mounting points. The explosive charges were powerful enough to affect their own mounting systems, potentially creating weak points that could be exploited with sustained fire. As Weber prepared to withdraw with his intelligence, disaster struck. A German artillery barrage, uncoordinated with his reconnaissance mission, began falling on the American positions. Shells exploded around Morrison's Sherman as the crew scrambled to start their engine and move to cover. Weber found himself trapped between the German artillery and American defensive positions, with nowhere to retreat safely. As he pressed himself into a shell crater, he watched Morrison's crew respond to the attack with professional efficiency that impressed even an enemy observer. "Driver, get us moving," Morrison shouted over the explosion noise. "Rodriguez, traverse left and look for muzzle flashes. They're firing from the ridgeline." The Sherman's engine roared to life as Bobby Jackson engaged the transmission and began maneuvering toward cover. But as they moved, another German Panzer IV emerged from concealment, its commander hoping to catch the American tank while it was distracted by the artillery barrage. Weber recognized the Panzer's commander, Unteroffizier Hans Richter, a veteran who had served with Weber's unit before being transferred to another company. Richter was an excellent tank commander, but he had no knowledge of the reactive armor system's capabilities. "Hans, no!" Weber shouted, forgetting his concealment in desperation to warn his fellow tanker. "Don't engage from the front." But his warning was lost in the noise of battle, as Richter's Panzer fired at Morrison's Sherman from optimal range and angle. The German shell struck one of the reactive armor boxes dead center, triggering the explosive charge exactly as Dr. Chen had designed. The projectile was deflected harmlessly into the night sky, while Morrison's tank continued maneuvering unharmed. Richter's confusion was visible even from Weber's distant position. The German commander was clearly struggling to understand how his perfect shot had failed to penetrate enemy armor. That moment of hesitation proved fatal, as Rodriguez traversed the Sherman's turret and returned fire with devastating accuracy. The American 76mm shell punched through the Panzer IV's side armor, detonating inside the fighting compartment with catastrophic results. Weber watched in horror as another German tank crew died to an enemy they couldn't effectively engage, their superior training and experience rendered meaningless by technological obsolescence. As the artillery barrage ended and American infantry began sweeping the area for German infiltrators, Weber realized his position was becoming untenable. He had gathered crucial intelligence about the reactive armor system, but he needed to survive long enough to deliver it to German command. Using skills learned during years of combat, Weber began a careful withdrawal through the hedgerows. His burns made movement painful, but the intelligence he carried was too valuable to risk capture. Every detail about the American armor system could potentially save German lives and help develop effective countermeasures. The journey back to German lines took most of the night, with Weber navigating by memory and instinct through terrain that had been fought over for weeks. American patrols were active, searching for German observers and artillery spotters, forcing him to take a circuitous route that added hours to his escape. When Weber finally reached German positions at dawn, he was exhausted, dehydrated, and running on pure determination. But the intelligence he brought back would prove invaluable for understanding the American technological breakthrough and developing tactical responses. Oberst Muller was waiting in the command bunker when Weber arrived, along with the division's senior engineering officer and intelligence staff. The reconnaissance mission's findings would be analyzed immediately and forwarded to the highest levels of Wehrmacht command. "Report, Obergefreiter," Muller ordered as Weber was helped into a chair and given water. "Sir, the American armor system uses explosive charges mounted in external boxes," Weber began, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "When struck by our shells, these charges detonate outward, deflecting the projectiles before they can penetrate the main armor." The engineering officer leaned forward with intense interest. "You observed this directly?" "Yes, sir. I watched one of our Panzer IVs score a direct hit at close range. The explosion from the American armor box deflected our shell completely. The enemy tank was undamaged and returned fire immediately." Weber's detailed report included sketches of the reactive armor placement, observations about potential vulnerabilities, and tactical recommendations for engaging the modified Shermans. The information was immediately classified at the highest level and prepared for transmission to Wehrmacht headquarters. "This changes everything," Mueller admitted after reviewing Weber's intelligence. "If the Americans can mass-produce this system, our entire anti-tank doctrine becomes obsolete overnight." The implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. German tank production was already struggling to keep pace with Allied numbers, and now their technological advantages were being systematically neutralized by American innovation. The war was entering a new phase where industrial capacity and technological adaptation would prove more important than traditional military virtues. As Weber received medical attention for his burns and exhaustion, he reflected on what he had witnessed. The American tank crew he had observed displayed the same professionalism and courage as German tankers, but they now possessed a technological advantage that rendered German weapons largely ineffective. The laughter that had greeted the Shermans' arrival in Normandy seemed like a distant memory. German confidence in their technological superiority was crumbling as rapidly as their tank formations under American fire. The secret weapon that had seemed so vulnerable was systematically destroying the foundation of Wehrmacht armored doctrine. But Weber's intelligence also provided hope. The reactive armor system had limitations and potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited with proper tactics and new weapons. The war was far from over, but it would now be fought on very different terms than anyone had anticipated. Weber's intelligence report triggered an immediate response from German high command. Within hours of receiving his reconnaissance findings, Wehrmacht engineers were working frantically to develop new tactics and weapons capable of defeating reactive armor. The urgency was palpable as reports continued arriving of German tank losses mounting across the Normandy front. Hauptmann Dietrich had assembled his best engineers in a converted barn that served as their field workshop. Scattered across makeshift tables were fragments of destroyed German tanks, captured American equipment, and hastily drawn diagrams based on Weber's observations. "We need solutions immediately," Dietrich announced to his team. "Every day we delay costs more panzer crews their lives. The reactive armor has specific vulnerabilities we can exploit." Based on Weber's intelligence, the engineers identified several potential countermeasures. The reactive armor boxes were designed to defeat single projectiles, but sustained fire might overwhelm the system. Additionally, the boxes only covered specific areas of the Sherman's hull and turret, leaving gaps that could be targeted by skilled gunners. If we can force multiple impacts on the same area, the reactive armor might exhaust itself, suggested Oberleutnant Karl Steiner, a former automotive engineer. The explosive charges can only detonate once. After that, the area becomes vulnerable to conventional penetration. The team also developed new tactical doctrines for engaging the modified Shermans. German tanks would attack from multiple directions simultaneously, forcing the Americans to expose their less protected rear and side armor. High explosive shells might damage the reactive armor mounting systems without triggering the defensive charges. But implementing these solutions required time that German forces didn't have. American Shermans equipped with reactive armor were advancing steadily through the Norman countryside, their crews growing more confident with each successful engagement. The psychological impact was as devastating as the tactical losses. Weber volunteered to lead a desperate counterattack using the new tactics his reconnaissance had made possible. Despite his injuries, he was the most experienced German tank commander who had directly observed reactive armor in action. His knowledge could mean the difference between success and catastrophic failure. "Give me a Tiger Eye and 2 Panzer IVs," Weber requested during the planning session. "I'll demonstrate that these American tanks can still be defeated." Moeller was reluctant to risk one of their few remaining Tiger tanks, but the strategic situation demanded bold action. "Very well, Weber. But this is our last chance to prove that German armor can still compete. If this attack fails, we'll have to completely rethink our defensive strategy." The German counterattack was planned for dawn, when morning mist would provide concealment for their approach. Weber's Tiger I would engage Morrison's Sherman from the front, drawing attention while the Panzer IVs maneuvered to attack the less protected flanks. The plan required precise coordination and flawless execution. As Weber climbed into the Tiger's commander position, he felt the weight of responsibility for his crew and the broader German defensive effort. This engagement would determine whether Wehrmacht forces could adapt to the American technological breakthrough or face inevitable defeat. Morrison's Sherman was positioned in a defensive hull-down position overlooking a key crossroads. The reactive armor boxes were clearly visible in the early morning light, their rectangular shapes giving the tank an oddly geometric appearance. Morrison's crew was alert but relaxed, confident in their armor's protective capabilities. "Movement on the ridgeline," Rodriguez reported through the intercom. "Looks like a Tiger tank with supporting panzers." Morrison felt a familiar surge of adrenaline as combat approached. The Tiger. I was the most formidable tank in the German arsenal, but the reactive armor had proven effective against every German weapon they had encountered. This would be the ultimate test of Dr. Chen's revolutionary technology. "Driver, reverse slope position," Morrison ordered. "Gunner, target the Tiger. Let's see how our armor holds up against an 88mm gun." Weber's Tiger opened fire first, its massive 80mm gun sending a tungsten core projectile streaking toward Morrison's Sherman at tremendous velocity. The German shell struck the reactive armor with devastating force, triggering an explosion that lit up the morning sky. But when the smoke cleared, Morrison's tank remained operational and undamaged. "Impossible," Weber muttered, watching his most powerful weapon fail against American armor. The Tiger's 88mm gun was capable of penetrating any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers, yet the Sherman had absorbed the hit without apparent damage. But Weber's tactical plan was already in motion. While the Tiger engaged from the front, his supporting Panzer IVs had maneuvered to attack Morrison's flanks where the reactive armor coverage was less comprehensive. The coordinated assault forced Morrison to choose which threat to engage first. Rodriguez traversed the turret toward the Tiger, but before he could fire, one of the Panzer IVs scored a hit on the Sherman's rear hull, where no reactive armor was mounted. The German shell penetrated the standard armor, causing significant damage to the engine compartment and starting a fire. "We're hit," Jackson shouted from the driver's position. "Engines burning and we're losing power." Morrison realized their invulnerability had been an illusion. The reactive armor was revolutionary, but not perfect. Skilled opponents who understood its limitations could still find ways to achieve penetrating hits. The technological advantage was significant, but not absolute. "Abandon tank," Morrison ordered as smoke began filling the fighting compartment. "Rodriguez, grab the classified materials. We can't let the Germans capture information about the reactive armor." Weber watched with grim satisfaction as the American crew bailed out of their burning Sherman. The tank that had seemed invincible was now a smoking wreck, proof that German tactics could still prevail against superior technology. But the victory felt hollow given the massive losses German forces had already sustained. As Morrison's crew escaped on foot, Weber's Tiger advanced to examine the destroyed Sherman. The reactive armor boxes were intact on the front and sides, But the successful hit had come from an angle where conventional armor provided the only protection. The lesson was clear. The American system had vulnerabilities that could be exploited by determined opponents. The engagement marked a turning point in the Normandy campaign, but not the one German forces had hoped for. While Weber had proven that reactive armor could be defeated, the tactical requirements for success were so demanding that few German crews could replicate his achievement. The Americans continued advancing with their technological advantage largely intact. In the weeks that followed, both sides adapted to the new reality of armored warfare. American engineers developed improved reactive armor systems that provided better coverage and reliability. German forces refined their tactics but struggled with declining numbers and increasingly desperate strategic situations. Weber survived the war and eventually met Morrison during a veterans' reunion decades later. The former enemies discovered a mutual respect born from their shared experiences with revolutionary technology that had changed the nature of tank warfare forever. "You know," Morrison told Weber during their conversation, "that reactive armor saved thousands of American lives, but it also taught us never to underestimate our opponents. Your counterattack showed us that technology alone doesn't win wars." Weber nodded thoughtfully. "And your armor taught us that innovation and adaptation matter more than tradition and arrogance. We laughed at your Sherman tanks, but you had the last laugh." The story of reactive armor became a case study in military innovation, demonstrating how technological breakthroughs could shift the balance of power in unexpected ways. Dr. Chen's revolutionary concept had transformed the Sherman from a vulnerable target into a formidable weapon system that helped secure Allied victory in Europe. The laughter that had greeted the Sherman's arrival in Normandy was replaced by respect for American ingenuity and industrial capability. The secret weapon that German troops had dismissed as inadequate had proven that in warfare, as in life, appearances could be deceiving and underestimation could be fatal. Today, reactive armor remains a standard feature on modern main battle tanks, a direct descendant of the revolutionary system that turned the tide of armored warfare in the Norman hedgerows. The legacy of that technological breakthrough continues to influence military thinking and remind us that innovation often comes from the most unexpected sources.